Hello, welcome to Angular Complete Series Part 9 Component Event Lifecycle Hooks. Now we know how to create components. As we have seen how to include components in DOM tree, now let's understand the event lifecycle hooks of a component. Component lifecycle hooks are the callback functions called by Angular on different stages of a component lifecycle. So from instantiation till the component destroyed, we get a couple of hooks that we can use to hook our logic in the component to manage the view presentation and state of a component. For each lifecycle hooks, Angular has provided an interface which a component class is supposed to implement for better type safety and avoid typos. If you see, one of the lifecycle hooks is ngOnInit, which has already been implemented by the CLI command when we created component. For this ngOnInit, our user detail component implements onInit interface. Alright, remove ngOnInit from the component and see our component is red underlined. On hover, you see a message. It is telling class incorrectly implements onInit interface. We can fix it by removing syntax where we are forcing this component must implement onInit interface. Remember, remove onInit when you are not going to use it, or implement the ngOnInit back. When you use interface properly, you get better IntelliSense support. So if you see here, as we have forced our component to implement onInit interface, if we press Ctrl plus space inside component, first thing we get in IntelliSense is ngOnInit hook. This is where TypeScript helps us avoid errors and make code type safe. Let's press enter and complete the function brackets. Similar to onInit, Angular have provided interfaces for all other hooks. Let's explore what are lifecycle hooks available in Angular for a component. Here we have two columns. In first column, we have an interface implementation, and in second column, we have interface which is supposed to be implemented. Constructor. We don't have any interface for this. When we create new object of a class, it's the constructor gets called first thing in that class, and it will always be called only and only once in complete lifecycle of an object. Same applies to component constructor. When Angular instantiate the component, for each instance, constructor will be called once. For constructor, we don't have any interface as such because it's a programming language feature. Constructors used to provide injectables and initialize read-only properties in Angular. Avoid writing any logic inside a constructor. Here onward, what we will be looking at the hooks added by the Angular as callbacks. First one is ngOnChanges. For now, just remember that it's called every time when there is a change in one or more input data bound property. If there is no input data bound property, it will not be called. You will understand it more when we learn about data bound properties. As of now, we have not defined any input property, so it will not be called. Next is ngOnInit. Initialize the directive or component after Angular first displays the data bound properties and sets the directive or component's input properties, called only once. If we have defined any input data bound property, then it will be called after first ngOnChanges, else called right after constructor, which means initialize your variable or make any HTTP call from here, which is supposed to happen on initialization. Also, this hook is a great place to write logic which have a dependency on input data bound properties. Next is ngDoCheck. Detect and act upon changes that Angular counter won't detect on its own, called every time when Angular change detection lifecycle runs and immediately after ngOnInit. Rarely used, don't worry too much about this as of now. Next is ngAfter content init. Respond after Angular projects external content into the components view. When you want to insert HTML elements or other components in a component, then you do that using the concept of a content projection, called once after the first ngDoCheck. We will understand more of it in content projection section. Next is ngAfter content checked. Respond after Angular checks the content projected into the directive or component called after ng after content init, and there onward every time after ng do check. Again, we will understand it in content projection section. Next is ng after view init. Respond after Angular initializes the component's view and child views, or the view that contains the directive, called once after the first ng after content check. Next is ng after view checked. Respond after Angular checks the component's view and child views, or the view that contains the directive, called after the ng after view init, and every time after ng after content checked. So the last one in the series we have is the ngOnDestroy. Cleanup just before Angular destroys the directive or component. Unsubscribe observables and detach event handlers to avoid memory leaks. Called when component removed from DOM. This is a good place to write all your cleanup logic. We will be using ngOnDestroy a lot. Enough of theory. Let's see about this in action. For the sake of time, here I have already implemented all the hooks interface. I have already written lifecycle hooks. As you can see, in each of these lifecycle hooks, I have just logged a message to the console. Alright, let's remove one selector from app.component.html and run the application. And see, this is working. As you can see here on the console, we have all logged messages except ngOnChanges. Reason we know now, because we don't have any input data one property. Rest, if you see, it is showing constructor followed by ngOnInit logged once, then we see ng do check. If you see here, it is logged twice. Reason is internally change detection lifecycle executed twice. This will be logged more times in real-time application. Similarly, ng after content checked and ng after view checked logged twice. To simplify it, we can remember it in this way that all init hooks called once, in addition with constructor and onDestroy. Remaining can be called more than once depending on states. Let's see one last thing. Let's include our component twice in app.component.html. Save and see the console. You see here constructor is logged twice, as well as all other hooks are logging twice which were logging only once. The reason is, as mentioned, that each time when we include the component into the DOM tree, it instantiates a fresh new instance. So here you can see our user detail component instantiated twice. As a result, we are getting these logged messages twice. If you don't get all of these hooks, don't worry. You will understand by the time passes or as we progress with our series. Alright, remember, what we will be using most out of these hooks are constructor, onInit, onDestroy, then there will be good use of onChanges, and remaining hooks have lesser frequency of use. We are making a good progress. Now we have good familiarity with components. Let's keep going without stopping our progress. Thank you. That was it for this video. See you in the next lecture.